Hi, everyone. Welcome. So this is Michigan Office of Rural Prosperity, and we are. I'm Prakriti. We have our introduction slide a little bit later, so I just want to introduce now. I'm Prakriti. I'm from Ross School of Business, doing my MBA. Here's Andrew. He's doing medicine, and here's Hedden. He's doing nursing, and we have one of our member missing today, but Joss, he's from law. Thank you for being here. And before we get into the details, I just want to start with something really simple. So over the last year, our team kept coming back to one thought that climate change is showing up in rural Michigan in very real ways, not in just textbooks, not just in charts, but in day-to-day life. So storms that hit harder, like unpredictable seasons, and sometimes there are roads and power lines that take longer to fix. And because rural communities play a lot of role in Michigan's identity and economy, we wanted to understand like how can rural communities plan ahead for a changing climate in the way that actually feels doable. So that was what our project is about. So let's move to a little bit about our partner. Let's understand them. Office of Rural Prosperity was founded in 2022 with the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, with one mission: help the rural communities thrive. And they have been an incredible partner. They do this in a very thoughtful way. They build leadership. They connect communities with resources, and they help people bring together so that they are not facing all these problems alone. And one thing that we really appreciated about ORP is right away that they get it. They understand rural communities deeply. They know like the people wear multiple hats, and they know priorities shift fast. So they wanted, and they also encouraged our project to be not just focused in like the environmental science aspect of it, but more about like a broader story about how the community's well-being also is being prioritized. That's what we moved onto the main problem statement of our project. When we scoped the project, we started with a big question like how to incorporate climate forward thinking into rural development. At the beginning, we did not just jump into like main conclusions, but we wanted to understand the like background, the landscape. So we cast out a wide net. We started by reading everything we could about how climate change affects Michigan's forest, water systems, and agriculture infrastructure. That gave us a baseline of what's happening physically and on the ground. So we also looked at the rural communities in other states so that we know like what is happening as the best practices or like the worst practices. With doing that, we were experimenting. Like we saw that places in Colorado in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest have tried new approaches to flooding, wildfire risk, or renewable energy. Then we looked at what rural communities in Michigan have already been dealing with. For example, earlier this year, an ice storm swept through northern Michigan, and that kind of event like stopped everything from the real life, and it affected everything. So there was another issue that we also discussed, like the Father's Day flood in Upper Michigan in 2018, which caused around like 46 millions of dollars in damage. This type of disasters were something very clear to us, but it was not just about the disasters. So there was one community solar project that had been preparing to launch, but the effort paused when anticipated federal funding was unexpectedly pulled. We also talked about this earlier, right? These kinds of stories made us realize that climate pressures are growing, but the real challenge is figuring out how to plan ahead when rural communities have limited time and limited staff and so many things to juggle at once. With all that information, we figured out that was one missing piece that we wanted to explore, and that was, like the rural voice. That's when we realized we needed to listen to people more than we analyzed all the data or like on all the things that we had. So we started meeting with people from city managers to rural leaders, and this is really where the project came to life. Once we understood all this, we followed a natural timeline. The first was understanding the project scope and foundation building. The second was learning from others. We got into like out into the world a little bit more. We went to the Rural Futures Summit, the Michigan Healthy Climate Conference, and other statewide conferences and conversations to hear what the real practitioners and policymakers are focused. And after that, we focused a lot in the community voices, all thanks to ORP for organizing all those to us. And during the fall, we brought everything together. We developed like actionable recommendations and deliverables. So these are just the pictures of what we did in the past year and what like our next deliverables are. So over to Andrew.
All right, so as Prakriti said, we spent a lot of time this year talking to community leaders kind of throughout rural Michigan and hearing their perspectives to really combine that with some of the insights from our research and our literature review. And here are just some of the quotes that we had heard from speaking to different folks kind of throughout really all of rural Michigan. And I think what you'll notice kind of right off the bat here is that a lot of these conversations, although we went into it interested in kind of their perspectives on climate resilience, a lot of these conversations were actually about more than climate resilience. A lot of what we heard was that these communities were challenging with a variety of considerations and issues varying from kind of shortages with funding, lack of local expertise and leadership. And it really spans the whole spectrum in terms of readiness to kind of begin developing plans to mitigate climate change. So on one side of the spectrum, we had folks like Rachel Presley from the Western UP Planning and Development Region in the top left quote saying, you know, I've got plans ready as far as how to fight back against climate change. We just need dollars, we just need funding, all the way to other concerns about funding expressed by those kind of in Brown City in particular, who expressed that there's challenges accessing funding, particularly for those in smaller communities where there might not be as large of a population size. And then we really had lots of other really rich conversations kind of with folks such as Kathy Reynolds in Munising County, who talked about how folks in her community were really just focused on economic survival and that they were living and dying by 100 days to her point, kind of between that 100-day period between Labor Day and Memorial Day and how dependent they were on the tourist industry. And so it wasn't until kind of they would start to notice impacts of precipitation changes and things impacting that industry that folks kind of would begin to notice the impacts of climate change and want to plan around it. And then again, just other quotes about how folks are not really interested in kind of urbanizing in the way that kind of folks might expect, and that there might need to be an alternative approach to kind of developing sustainability resilience. So all of this was incredibly formative for ultimately our major deliverable, which is a climate resilience report. And we spent a lot of time as a team grappling with the question of how we can make evidence-based kind of recommendations pertinent specifically to rural Michigan. So we're not just kind of regurgitating science or recommendations, but making it so that communities like the ones we've spoken to can see themselves in the report and their struggles and think that our recommendations are actually applicable to them. So ultimately, our report ended up having about 6 parts total to it, and it was organized around key questions from our partner. Things like how exactly do we expect climate change to impact rural Michigan in the coming decades, where we talk about changing precipitation patterns again, the warming climate, and the effect that that's likely to have on not just agriculture, but also migration into rural Michigan. We talk about specific strategies for mitigation and adaptation using recommendations about climate smart agriculture from the UN FAO. And we also look kind of outside of Michigan to other communities and what they're doing to draw inspiration from others about how we can begin to move forward and combat climate change. With additional feedback from our partner, we kind of wanted to also include specific sections that address the kind of question of how communities can get started with a lot of this work. And so we really leveraged pieces from the US Climate Resilience Toolkit to make references to their 6 steps framework for how to implement projects and identify risks and vulnerabilities in a systematic way and begin to plan around those. And we also have sections that specifically address the concerns around funding and local expertise development that we heard so frequently kind of while talking to community members. So the former report was really designed to be a kind of internal document, something for our partner to hopefully help guide statewide strategy in terms of the kinds of investments they would make in rural communities. But we also wanted to create a shorter form toolkit that could be more externally facing. So this would be something more kind of tailored to the city planners, the kinds of individuals we were speaking to in recent months, that would, again, kind of focus on how they could get started with this work. Includes a shorter form, kind of step-by-step outline that includes resources on kind of how to have discussions about these risks and vulnerabilities in the first place. And really is designed to kind of bridge that gap between inception of the idea to a kind of execution of an initial project, focusing on process. Other sections, again, look at capacity building and funding, as well as kind of illustrate and highlight some of the local success stories and bright spots that we heard along the way. Examples like where communities were able to leverage kind of like high school interns to help them with grant applications and such. So this was a overall incredibly rewarding project for all of us, I think it's safe to say. As we kind of take a step back, I think we've learned a lot about kind of some of the challenges that face rural communities in Michigan, how they feel stuck in this cycle of kind of recovery and just coping with the most recent disaster rather than being able to look futuristically and ahead and plan proactively. Challenges, again, with funding and capacity and the tension between knowing kind of what the scientific recommendations might be and how they can actually implement things on the ground. Some of the things that we thought, kind of looking back on this whole experience, that we felt and learned for ourselves would be helpful were just kind of this starting small and planning ahead, beginning with kind of tightly focused pilot projects before kind of scaling upwards. And again, going through systematically the different risks and vulnerabilities that a community faces and kind of using that to help prioritize. Leveraging external capacity so that they don't feel like they're alone in this work and that they have to kind of have all of the expertise in-house, but that they can rely on others to provide kind of recommendations and support. Also kind of engaging in networking sessions through ORP and kind of building those partnerships to kind of share experiences and learn from others, and then kind of, again, making sure that they are communicating effectively to help build that local buy-in that is so essential for success in these projects. We've heard really great stories from folks like in Cadillac about how, as they were trying to get solar kind of off the ground, there was a lot of skepticism initially, but a lot of that was able to be kind of dispelled once folks were able to hear the benefits in terms of kind of reducing utilities bills and such. This is just a quote from our partner, ORP. We are very grateful for their partnership and guidance along this process. Obviously, this work is incredibly meaningful, and we could not have done it without them. And this is our team. And in addition to ORP, just wanted to acknowledge the Dow company as well as the Graham Sustainability Institute for their support of this work.